Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another one of the Military Aviation Museum's ongoing webinars. We're pleased to be able to bring this program to you this evening. It's an exciting subject matter. We're going to take a look at Base Air Depot number 1, which is in Burtonwood in the United Kingdom. We've got Aldon Ferguson joining us this evening from the UK, so we thank you all for joining us at this earlier 5 p.m. time. We did set it up this way so that we wouldn't have quite the time difference. We didn't want to keep Aldon up into the wee hours of the morning for his presentation. So we certainly appreciate his schedule accommodating us and all of you who joined us here this evening. Thank you for joining us at the adjusted time. Our speaker tonight is Aldon Ferguson. Aldon, like so many in the UK, got interested in aviation at a young age through the Great Air Cadets program. His interest in airfields actually began by looking at the history of the field where they were stationed as an air cadet unit. Aldon was explaining to me earlier that people had jokingly asked him, when his book was coming out, as he talked passionately about the field. And he ultimately ended up working with the local historical society to produce a 50-cent booklet. And he was able to observe the interest that people had in the subject matter and in the airfield. So that led him on to research other fields. He describes his fascination with Burtonwood as having a special place among the landscape of airfields in the United Kingdom. And I think tonight he's going to take us on a journey through the history of that field and articulate why it has a special place among those facilities. Aldon has written 9 books on RAF history and history of the airfields with a specific attention to airfield architecture and other features. He also works with the government over in the United Kingdom to actually record airfield information and the historic buildings on facilities that are closing. And this is done to maintain knowledge and information about the fields for the public record. We've had a great many presentations in our webinar program to this point that have cataloged some of the fields over here in the United States. And this care and attention to the legacy of these closing fields is something that we really don't have here in the United States and really could stand to have. So maybe there's a great question in here for Aldon about how we might all be able to bring a little bit of his experience there in the UK to our airfields here in the United States. But Aldon financed his incredible volunteer career working on these airfields through his career in commercial real estate. And interestingly, he was telling us just before the presentation began about the 17 years he spent in the former Soviet Union. Now, with all that said, Aldon, we're about ready for you to take it away. Can you hear us? Are you ready to go?
Keegan, I am. Thank you very much. That's a great lead in. Thank you very much indeed. So, ladies and gentlemen, good.
It's all yours, Aldon. Take it away.
Thank you. Well, welcome to Burtonwood, England, which was the largest military airbase in the UK during World War II, home to 18,500 American servicemen and women during World War II, and it was the last base in the UK to close. Closed down at the end of World War II. It closed in June 1946. And if I can get, I'm sorry, the slides, here we go. Because of my involvement with Burtonwood, we formed the Burtonwood Association way back in 1987 to perpetuate the memory of the men and women who worked at Burtonwood from 1939, when it opened as an RAF station, right through to the eventual close down in 1993. It had a very strange history. And tonight I'm going to talk about specifics, but I'm just going to trace briefly through the development of the airfield. It was built for the RAF as a maintenance unit, a maintenance and support unit, and a civilian repair depot. But when the USA joined, in fact, even before Pearl Harbor, high-ranking American Air Force officers have been over to the UK to look around the various bases, knowing that one day they will need bases in the UK. And they selected 3, which I will discuss, in the northwest of England, far away from Germany and from the European continent. And they were chosen to be the base air depots. We have an association which is to perpetuate the memory. We have a heritage center I'll show you in a second. We do reunions in the USA. We should have been in Little Rock, Arkansas last year. We put it back to October this year and hope it happens. We also have reunions in the UK. And We do a magazine. I edit this magazine, and oddly enough, this magazine was issued today. It's the 35th year which we've been running it, and this is showing an Iroquois in front of the army base in the 80s at Burtonwood. It opened, as I say, as an RAF station. It was taken over by the United States Army Air Corps, and then, of course, that became the United States Army Air Force in 1942. It was the last station to close, as I said, in 1946, handed back to the RAF for 2 years, and then the Cold War started, and it became a United States Air Force base from 1948 right through to 1965. In 65, the base closed down. It lay empty for 2 years, and then President de Gaulle of France took France out of NATO, and the huge army, US Army units in France had to go somewhere, and they moved into Burtonwood. So from 1967 right through till 1993, it was a major US Army base, unique in Britain. The Heritage Centre is this building here with the nose of the C-54, because when it reopened in 1948, Burtonwood undertook the 200-hour maintenance checks on the C-54s taking part in the Berlin airlift. They would come in every 200 flying hours. There was nowhere in Germany equipped to do it because we bombed it and blitzed it, and there just weren't the facilities or the manpower available. So they came here to Burtonwood. The first C-54 going through the program took 9 days to complete, but by the end, getting towards September 1949, they were able to put 9 aircraft through in 1 day. And inside our Heritage Centre, we have a model of the base. We have a huge amount of memorabilia, photographs, albums, and behind there's a series of small buildings, including a chapel where we have some plaques to the deaths, but we also have a huge memorial wall or celebratory wall to the GI brides. So Burtonwood is all about numbers and big things. And here's a typical view across the hard standings from one site to 2 other sites with B-17s wall to wall. It's just big and big and big. And everywhere you looked, it wasn't just B-17s. Clearly, you've got quite a mix on this picture. And if you look down here, we've got a C-47. Sorry, can I get that? Yeah, the C-47s. There's a B-26s. There will be some B-24s, as well as the B-17s, which predominated. The great thing about having organised and set up the Burtonwood Association was that I have met a huge number of men who worked on the projects I'm going to talk about tonight. They were very, very generous with their time, their memories, and their photographs, and they gave me a massive amount of information verbally and in writing. And I salute them all. Most of them have left us, they've gone to the hangar in the sky, but this is their story. Again, a typical view across the pan. This is a bit more interesting in that we have RAF Mosquitoes over here, and they were here. There's one over here with the RAF Roundel on. They were here to be converted into photo reconnaissance aircraft. In the background, you may be able to see, depending upon your screen, some B-17s. There's a tail there with a K on it. There's a P-38 Lightning there. It was a big and a very important place. Now, the organisation, came under the control of the Air Service Command, not the individual air forces. The 8th Air Force was the predominant one in the UK, but Burtonwood came under the Air Service Command, and established at Burtonwood was BARDA, the Base Air Depot area, which had the responsibility for the supply and the maintenance of all the equipment initially in the UK. Eventually, it was providing equipment for the 8th, 9th, 12th, and 15th Army Air Forces. And also at Burtonwood was Base Air Depot number 1 and BARDA Control number 2 at Langford Lodge, which was in Northern Ireland, and BAD 3 at Wharton, which is north of Burtonwood between Preston and our tourist resort, Blackpool, up in northern Lancashire. Wharton is still operational in that it is our major military aircraft factory. And BARDA also control many other aspects, including these strategic air depots. For some reason, they were called strategic. They were actually smaller air depots on the eastern side of the country, places like Honington and Watton, which you may have heard of. Now, these are locations. This is where we're located. The RAF initially did not want to give up Burtonwood because it was an important base to them. And it was very strategically located for the USA because it was close to the port of Liverpool, a deep water port with miles and miles of dock. Eventually, they did persuade. Burtonwood was up and running in early 1942 as the USA joined World War II. And so it was immediately available. The RAF were pushed out. Wharton was slow, coming online a little later. Langford Lodge was predominantly run by civilians, by the Lockheed Overseas Corporation. And but they did a lot of work, but it was a smaller base. Burtonwood, as I said, had about peak 18,500 personnel. Wharton had approximately 15,000 personnel. And besides aircraft, they were repairing, overhauling, checking engines, aero engines. And Burtonwood tended to specialize in radial engines and Wharton on inline engines. Now, the bases they were supporting, if you can see, this is a map of England. You've got Ireland over here. You've got continental Europe down here. This is Holland and France. All these dots are American air bases in the UK, 300 plus, and that's only the air bases. Now, of particular interest to you will be Gox Hill. This is Gox Hill here, just south of the River Humber, and that is where the control tower that you have at Virginia Beach came from. And Burtonwood was on the other side of the coast here, Wharton was up there, Langford Lodge over there. But this just gives an indication of the number of bases occupied by the United States Army Air Force. But this is only the airfields. There were at least 300 other support depots, including motor vehicle companies, hospitals, ammunition stores, port depots, etc. in the UK. And this is what the Americans inherited when they first moved in. It was originally opened as a 2-runway airfield. And the 2 runways were this one across here and this little short one here. As aircraft became more sophisticated, it was clear that they needed a longer and a better runway. And this runway also had an approach over buildings or very close to buildings. So they closed that and realigned it down here. And they built this new runway, this one, almost east-west. There's the North Point down there. And this was a mile long. It was 5,600 feet long. So from there to there, 1 mile, with the various dispersed sites around the perimeter. So you get a better idea. It looked like this. It's been tilted to get everything in. And you can see that where north is there. Then we have the main runway here. There was a series of sites. There were a series of sites, and the most predominant one was this. BRD stands for Burtonwood Repair Depot, a huge site, and this was mostly engine repair, but there was also a school of technical training to train British ground crew on American airframes and engines. They overhauled the engines there, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of them. They did all the fabrication in there, and they did all the work to do with radios, guns, propellers, engines, any component part of the aircraft. Living sites, living site 1 here, there was approximately 1,000 to 2,000 personnel living on each site. 2 site was down here with a hospital, 3 site across here, 4 and 5 up here, which were built during the American occupation. And there was a site 6 down here as well. And then dispersed sites with hangars. There were a total of 13 hangars. plus these massive storage sheds and dispersals. There was dispersals spread way out here, so the aircraft could be parked and hopefully be a minimal target for the Luftwaffe. In fact, the base was bombed before Pearl Harbor, but it was never attacked from the air post Pearl Harbor, which is amazing when you see the numbers of aircraft which were there. So it was a huge, huge base. Here's an aerial photograph of it. Looking down again, this is orientated to show the runway north-south. You can just see the outline there of the original runway, which came down here, but now it's been extended. Now these hangars here, they have the door openings are 150 feet. There's the three, they can take all our largest aircraft, but when you look at the size of these storage warehouses, it was big. And this one doesn't even show the BRD site. So this was taken admittedly towards the end of the war, and it's well worn. And if you look very carefully, you'll see there's aircraft parked on dispersals here and here. You can see some of them parked on the airfield. They had hundreds of aircraft on the base at any one time. Here we have predominantly P-47s, and these are either, I can't date the photograph, but they are either waiting to be boxed and sent back to the States or across to Japan at the end of the war, or they were sitting here waiting to go through the production hangars to go out to the squadrons. It's difficult to tell, but these aircraft all came over as deck cargo on ships. They took the wingtips off, they took the tail off, and they took the propeller off, and then they encapsulated in cosmally in a form of cocooning in rubber. And they came over by sea, and they came into Liverpool Airport, Speke Airport, where Lockheed reassembled them and flew them into Burtonwood. A large number were also assembled here at Burtonwood. On the same dispersal, on another date, we had this group of aircraft, brand new B-17s, sitting here waiting to be brought into service. Any modifications which were needed were undertaken at Burtonwood. The production lines, to make sure that they didn't slow down the production lines, they tended to only put modifications on them at certain intervals. So what they did is they flew them over to Britain and they did the modifications here and then issued them out to the squadrons. They produced thousands of them. I'll give you some numbers very shortly. You can see a couple in the distance over there, and this is a living site, one of the dispersed sites. Everything was dispersed because we were scared stiff of enemy bombing. We were lucky it didn't happen. And just to give an indication of the throughput of aircraft, we have a couple of clerks here with a lovely typewriter. Aircraft ready for delivery. You can't read the board very clearly. I can on the original. Aircraft ready for test. They had a complete flight test department with a group of test pilots and ground crew. And they wanted to push these aircraft through Burtonwood as fast as they possibly could to get them out into service. BRD site, this is just one of the views taken from the top of one of the buildings. It had an internal railway system. You can see there's a steam engine, steam locomotive there, and wagons, and it spread a vast distance, several very, very large buildings, and it's within these buildings the engine overhaul took place. There was a foundry. They could make propeller blades, they could overhaul engines, they could repair dinghies, they could repair parachutes, they could do anything. You can see there's a line of railway wagons here. Here there's an archway to the Airmen's Club, the mess hall, and on that sign it says, "Through this arch pass the world's best mechanics." Looking a bit further around to the right, we're getting a view. There's more railways, there's railway wagons here, there's a railway track going way up there. And looking further right again, these are engine test houses, hush houses. Initially, the engines were put in there, test run, and then they were boxed and sent to wherever they were going or put onto the aircraft on the site. Eventually, but there wasn't enough of them, they had to extend them, so they built a whole row of external ones there. And these engines were running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the whole of the local town, which was only about a mile away, could hear the roar of aero engines throughout the entire wartime period. And they said when they turned off those engines in 1946, there was an eerie silence right across the area because they'd lived with it 24 hours a day. Sadly, the rail line created a few deaths because the trains were shunting, and with the noise of the engines you couldn't hear, and there were a few, both British civilians and American military, who were actually killed by trains on this track, sadly. So a few numbers before we move on to the specifics. It was officially taken over in October 43, but in fact the first Americans arrived in June 1942. And these were the numbers on the field at the time, only 181 aircraft in November 43. By February 45, the numbers had grown dramatically. There were 375 aircraft sitting out on the field, as in those photographs I showed of the dispersals. But during the 1 month of February, they had put through and delivered the 467 B-17s. But it doesn't stop there. P-47s, they had delivered 306 of them. B-26s were coming through, and the project for top four here, these were new aircraft which were being brought into the theatre, and then the others were inspections, repairs, conversions, modifications, etc. But the total number of aircraft provided to the Air Force, the US Air Force, in February 1945, this is just Burtonwood, it's not the other two BADs, was over 1,000. An incredible performance. And the engine performance was pretty impressive too. Now, just looking at the numbers, the number of B-17s which were built during the whole of World War II and before, 12,731. Of those, 4,243 passed through Burtonwood. That's 33% of every B-17 constructed in the US passed through this base, and 28% of every P-47 which came through Burtonwood. Quite a figure. Engine production was also critical because the engines needed to be serviced, they needed to be checked, needed to be overhauled, and in November 43, they were averaging 29 a day. By the time we got to February, they were averaging 77 a day. All these engines had to be tested. They had to go to these test rigs and be put left running for a certain number of hours to check everything was fine. They were taken off. Most of them passed, some of them failed. The other work that was done on the base was modifications. They would modify, they would prefabricate kits to be modified onto the aircraft. For instance, bulletproof windscreens, 2,000 kits to be sent out to the active squadrons so they could be actually installed on the squadrons. Armor plate, they found, for instance, the pilot's seat on a B-17 was not adequate. The armor plating was not good enough. They designed, manufactured and issued 2,000 kits, all these different types of fitting. This is just a taster of the sort of work they did. If they couldn't get anything from the States, and of course they were relying on very, very long lines of communication, and that also the shipping was suffering, especially in 43, terrible losses from U-boats, what they couldn't get from the States was manufactured on site. And they could make anything from valve springs to bulletproof seats. So I move on to the specifics I want to talk about tonight, the modification programs that they did in great secrecy, and this was one of the most secret, the Carpetbagger project. And the project, these were all B-24s that were converted. And the concept here was for dropping supplies and agents to the resistant forces, the Marquis in France and other countries across occupied Europe. So they took a basic B-24 and they took the front turret off. They took the ball turret off. They put a plexiglass nose on it. You can see the one behind here, the nose turret's gone. This is in one of the hangars on Burtonwood. They had to, these aircraft, because they were operating at night, individually in most cases, they needed the absolute latest and best fit for radios and for navigational kit. They installed Rebecca. They even put flame dampers onto the engines to hide any telltale glow from the exhausts. They put flash hiders on the muzzles of the few guns which were left for defense. They got rid of most of those guns, and they even put blackout curtains inside the aircraft so no light could be emitted from the aircraft, and they painted them gloss black. They reckoned that at night that was the best color, interestingly gloss and not matte. And where the ball turret was a hole in the fuselage, and that is through which they dropped the agents. They call the agents Joes, and there's a picture coming up of those. So the instructions were given to Burtonwood literally on Christmas Day, 1943. The place operated the 3-shift day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And this particular project was given the highest priority on the base. Everything had to be dropped for getting this through. And a specific group of guys operated this project. The rest of the base continued as normal. This was in secret. Initially, they converted 23 aircraft, and by February, they had 8 100% complete and several others behind. They got the first 23 out extremely quickly. One of our members, who is still very much alive and kicking in California, said working on this project for a day was like working on other projects for 2 days. He said the pressure was intense. They were almost cracking whips on our backs to get these aircraft out. They were needed so desperately. Massive, massive pressure. Here's a couple of examples. You can see the noses, the plexiglass nose, the turret had gone totally. You can also see the bulge in the side of the cockpit area here and on this one, which was incorporated, so we got a better view looking down when they were looking for the drop zones. The drop zones were set out by the resistance, and they were lit very glimly with torches or flares. They could not attract the Germans' attention, so that's why they needed every bit of aid they could, including putting a navigator in the nose to look down on the ground and see. This particular one on the right, you can see, was called Brer Rabbit. The pilot, standing on the left here, his name was Clinton Rabbit, so his aircraft was named as Brer Rabbit. The waist guns were taken out. They only had, they took the mid-upper off. Really, the only gun they had in defense was the tail gun. They kept that because clearly that was the direction from which they were most likely to be hit. Somewhat a German night fighter trailing them. So they had the bomb bay with specific canisters in, which I'll show you in a second. The smaller items were taken through the side waist gunner positions like this. Interesting things they were dropping, including a tire. So obviously the resistance were using vehicles, and they would send radio messages through. This is what we need. First aid kit going through. And then the usual way they would drop it would be in a canister, which was toughened. They could put these in the bomb bay. They could drop them by parachute, and they could just put anything up to a certain size in there, and that would be delivered. So all this work was undertaken on Burtonwood, and the aircraft were then taken across to Harrington, which is towards the east side of the country. And this is a photograph of what they call Joes. They never mixed the agents who were going to be dropped with the crews, and only the pilot and navigator knew where they were going. And therefore, if the aircraft did have to crash, force land, or if the crew had to bail out for any reason and were captured, they wouldn't know who they were carrying or where they were going. Secrecy was absolutely sacrosanct. They moved location a few times, but Harrington was the place which they ultimately operated from. In the end, post-war, it became a Thor missile base for a while. And here we have, bottom right, we have what they call the Joe hole. And that is where the ball turret was located. There was a door on the left-hand side. which they would fold across. It looks like a huge toilet, but it's not. And they would drop out of there parachuting unless the aircraft was going to land, which sometimes they did, but generally they parachuted out. And there's a memorial at Harrington, and here are two people, the civilians in the middle there, who actually operated the squadron. And on the side of the memorial, you can see the outline of the aircraft with the plexiglass nose. And it's a specific Carpetbagger memorial, and it was dedicated at Harrington in 1987. In the end, there was a total of 54 of these aircraft which were converted at Burtonwood, and they did lose several of them due to enemy action. So that was the Carpetbagger project, absolute urgency, and done in incredible secrecy. The next project was a smaller type of aircraft, and that was to motorize the Waco glider. We call this the Hadrian in the UK. We operated these as well as gliders. And the conversion was designated a PG-2A, and it's here on what was known as Mary Ann site with the two engines. The idea was that they could operate under their own power and therefore would not require a tug aircraft. They were quite heavy gliders, and it took either a C-47 or one of our four-engine bombers, the older bombers, a Halifax or a Stirling, to tow these aircraft. If they could operate independently like this, not only could they land in a more organized way because they actually had the power, but they could possibly even be returned back to the UK. That was the concept. The original design was put together in the States, and some drawings were sent over, but there were no parts. They had to manufacture all the parts themselves. So at Burtonwood, there was a design and engineering office, which was also highly secret. And they had to do all the pioneering work of determining how these engines were going to be fitted, where the fuel tanks were going to go, where the instrumentation, the controls, the throttle controls, the mixture controls, everything else was going to go, and could they make it work? This is the standard Waco CG4A, as you can see. Can't see the tow rope, but the flaps are up, so I'm assuming this one's actually being towed into the air. And then here's another shot of the conversion. They did keep the facility to tow it, but of course the engines made it much heavier, and it was going to make it even more difficult, plus the drag from the propeller, because it doesn't look like a constant speed prop, that one. They had terrible problems getting the parts. They had problems even getting engines. They didn't have suitable engines this size on Burtonwood, and they ended up, we believe, with Lycoming engines. This is the only picture I've got, and I'm told it's a Lycoming. This is maybe another shot here, an inverted six-cylinder straight six engine. The guys who worked on this, and I've spoken to many of them, sadly all now gone. One of the big problems they had was the fuel lines. The fuel lines they first put in were too rigid, and when they started the engine, the fuel line cracked, so they had to put flexible lines in. They had to fit the throttle at high level. And these are the throttle cables and levers up here, because the engines, if I go back a slide, of course, are on the top of the wing. It's a high wing glider, so they were up there. They had no fuel gauges inside the aircraft. They put fuel gauges on the tanks in the wing, and the only way to read them was through the windows at the side. They had to get somebody in the crew to go back and look at the fuel gauges. In fact, they made one of these aircraft, and before it was finished, the whole project was cancelled. They were gearing up to do kits so they could start modifying hundreds and hundreds of these aircraft, because they came over in crates and they were being assembled all over the UK. Before they could do that, the authorities said, no, sorry, stop. We don't need this facility anymore. The guys who had worked on it, both the guys who did the conversion and the guys who had designed it and been out to beg, borrow and steal the parts and the engines, they begged, please let us fly it. Let us prove that it worked. And it did. And here's a couple of photographs. The bottom one over BRD site. the top one over a farmhouse, which was requisitioned, in fact, here in the distance on the other side of the airfield. But these are the guys who did the work on the aircraft, and it flew. And when it flew over BRD site, they were wondering what the heck it was, because it was so unusual. So sadly, it was a very successful conversion. It worked, they proved it, but it was withdrawn and cancelled. And they were told in September 1945, scrap it. And they did. And very sadly, this guy is running away from it. It's the end of the aircraft, and they were quite upset about it, but they were very, very proud of it. So yet another project. Not many people know about them, but this was undertaken, designed, fabricated, operated at Burtonwood. The next one is the Aphrodite project. Now, the Aphrodite project was the name of the Air Force project, and the US Navy was simultaneously converting PP4Ys, the Liberator, and they called it Anvil, but it was the same project. And the idea here, or the purpose of this project, was to take out heavily defended targets, such as U-boat pens, V1 launch sites and manufacturing sites, which were so well protected by reinforced concrete that ordinary bombs were just not going to work. And these aircraft were converted in two different ways. One became a mother aircraft and one became the baby. And the baby was stuffed full of explosive, literally. The mothers were designated the BQ-7. This is a mother aircraft here. And the baby was radio controlled by the mother aircraft, with the two aircraft would take off side by side. Once they were airborne, a couple of thousand feet, the mother aircraft would endeavour to take control of the baby. But remote control during the war using valves and the very old, in comparison to modern day systems they were using, they had a lot of trouble in getting full control of the aircraft. And it caused quite a problem. The babies were called CQ4s. This is what they were aiming at. Here we've got U-boat pen in Bordeaux, the double thickness of reinforced concrete with a gap in between, and the bombs which we had dropped, both the British and the Americans, on these U-boat pens were not doing any damage at all. They had armor-plated doors, massive great doors here. They were the most vulnerable. So the idea was the baby aircraft, stuffed full of explosive, would be flown remotely by the mother aircraft and would be flown into the doors to try and destroy the door and hopefully the U-boat inside. It was a very bold project, which was done in great secrecy, and they were stripped of all combat equipment. All non-essential gear went. The armor, the guns, the bomb racks, the seats. They could remove 12,000 pounds weight from the aircraft and 30,000 pounds of Torpex explosive, British torpedo explosive, which was 50% more explosive than normal TNT, was put into the aircraft. The two as-on radio receivers were coupled up to the autopilot. One gave pitch up and down, the other one gave yaw or roll side to side, and they were the major control from the mother aircraft. I also had two television cameras, and of course 1943, 44, TV was very much in its infancy. But they had two cameras inside the baby aircraft. One was looking at the instrument panel to see what that was showing, height, speed, attitude, and the other one was looking through the cockpit, through the window, looking forward to see where the aircraft was, and that was what they were using for aiming it. They had a radio altimeter because height was critical, especially on the U-boat pens. So they closed the bomb bays. Once the equipment was in, they actually welded them closed, hopefully not with the Torpex inside. And they could accommodate 7 tons of Torpex in the bomb bay. and they put another 3 tons of Torpex into the front part of the fuselage. And sadly, it wasn't very successful. Here we have one. The main problem was the remote control, in that they tried very hard to be able to get full control of the baby aircraft so they could actually aim it accurately, but sadly, it just didn't work. The job was given to 567 Bomb Squadron. They were at Honington first and then moved to Woodbridge in Suffolk, which had a runway which was about 15,000 feet long and about 600 feet wide. It was an emergency landing runway, and because they were operating these aircraft, or one of the aircraft, almost remotely, they decided to use that base. The baby aircraft was actually launched, taken off with a crew of 2, and the flight deck, they took the top. This is the front of the cockpit area of the B-17. Goodness knows why they took it off, because there's no way the crew could have bailed out over the side, because they were so close to the wing they would have hit the wing. The only way they could bail out was out through the rear door. But they carried a crew of 2, and as soon as the aircraft was airborne and control to a point was gained by the mother aircraft, they would then arm the explosive, and then the crew would bail out. Once they bailed out, it was then up to the mother aircraft to guide it on to the target. The first 4 sorties were all flown on the same day, which was the 4th of August 1944, and they all failed. They sometimes they just lost control, or they didn't have enough control. There were various reasons, and it wasn't just one reason, so it wasn't something they could home in on and say, this is why they're failing. If we fix this, we've got the problem sorted. There was all sorts of different reasons. 22 aircraft, or 22 B-17s, were converted, but one of the PP-4Ys is the one in the Anvil project, which Lieutenant Joseph Kennedy was in, and he was killed. He was flying the baby aircraft with another crewman, and he went back to charge the explosive, to arm it, to fuse it, and the aircraft exploded. It almost took out the mother aircraft as well, because 10 tons of explosive was going to do a lot of damage. So sadly, he was killed, one of the tragic Kennedys to go. But the failure rate was so high, they never ever had success with this system, which is really sad. And in January 1945, General Spaatz said, enough. It's costing money, it's taking time and effort. We've lost Kennedy, they lost some other crews as well. We need to abandon it. So they gave up. So it was a project done in great secrecy. Once they'd finished at Woodbridge, they took it to another airfield in East Anglia called Furze Field. They operated from there, but it didn't work. But the aircraft went for scrap over to Northern Ireland. In fact, you can see the hills of Northern Ireland over here on this particular photograph. And here we've got ground crew showing off a very unusual view of a B-17 with part of the cockpit area missing. So another project which was undertaken at Burtonwood, one of many, many projects, but nobody knew about it. The official diary, the records of the base, everything was secret until a long time afterwards. So once we got our association going in the late 80s, of course, the secrecy had well gone by then. And the guys who operated on these projects were able to tell me about them and give me a load of photographs. So we move on to the next one, which is a much simpler and more luxurious scenario, which was deluxing, which is an interesting word, aircraft for the army generals in the field. These were aircraft conversions, a mixture of C-47s, 17s and C-54s, and they were to be used by the real senior officers, people like Patton down. They had their own personal aircraft, and once we had the foothold in Europe, the invasion had been successful. The generals needed to be able to get around their patch and to see what was going on. So they needed a base everything had been blitzed. It was a front-line scenario. There was no accommodation suitable for them. So the idea was that they would convert these aircraft so that they could be used as an office and accommodation for the senior officers. And here they're putting, well, they got wide loading doors here. These are in the hangar waiting for individual work to be done to them. But again, this project was given very, very high priority. They fitted out these aircraft and the bigger ones as well with a bed, with an office, with meeting space, a bathroom, a toilet, a kitchen, and in some cases, provision for carrying a Jeep. Not easy to get a Jeep into a C-47, but they did. They took it through at an angle, through the open door, and actually got it in. I'll show you one in a moment. The design, the acquisition of all the materials, and the actual modification work was all undertaken at Burtonwood. And my slides have stopped moving. Sorry. Need to move this. Here we go. So the generals didn't want to clamber up a ladder. So here is a sort of doorway which was put in for them. The inside was fitted out like a mini executive jet. You've got the seating on the right there. There's a bed, and they could have meetings in these aircraft. Very nice seating. These seats were made at Burtonwood. The table was made at Burtonwood. The carpet was found and put in, and lighting, curtains. Clearly, they had to do a lot. There's a bed on the right-hand side there. You can just see, and a briefcase. You can see the airline style seating, the lighting. Very, very early precursor of luxury travel. Here we have the bed and a meeting area on the right-hand side, blinds on the windows, a reading light, a telephone. It was a home from home. And there was a small group of guys who did all this work, and they were hammered. They were really, really pushed to get it done extremely quickly. Here, you can see the nose of a Jeep. I'll get my spotlight back. Here we go. And here you can see the Jeep in the aircraft. Now, I'm not sure what type of aircraft this is. It's not very easy to tell. But the ramps to get this Jeep in and out are here strapped to the roof. So they would take those down, they put them through the door. You can see the open doorway just here, and the Jeep would come in and out. So the general had his home, his office, his bathroom, his kitchen, and his own personal transport. This is a number of the ones which were not necessarily the complete list, but the ones which were modified at Burtonwood. This particular was in the week of the 13th of April, 1945. You can see there's a mixture of C-54s, B-17s, and C-47s, and you can see the names on the left-hand side. There was one for General Eisenhower, there's one for General Spaatz. General Ott here was the base commander. Brigadier General Ike Ott was Barda Base Air Depot Area Commander. Interestingly, Stratemeyer here, he was the commander in charge of China. And I believe this aircraft, this B-17, went out to China to become his personal aircraft out there. So quite a project. They produced this cartoon towards the end of the war. This is getting out a general ship in Hangar 5. So you get the first telephone call, Colonel, get the ship out by Saturday, down to the Major. Sir, I'll have it out by Friday, down to the Lieutenant. I'll have it out by Thursday. Warrant Officer, I'll have it out by Thursday morning. The Hangar Chief needs it Thursday morning. The crew chief is saying, you can't go home until you got these finished. It wasn't quite that bad, but they were put under a lot of pressure. But in the end, this is the majority of the crew with Major Kirk down here. He was the officer in charge of the group. Two of these guys were members of our association, sadly passed away now, but they did the majority of the internal fitting out work. And they have many, many letters of commendation from the generals. I've got copies of them. Their work was credited and they look happy enough, but this photograph was taken at the end of the project. So that was a happy project. It kept the generals happy. The guys enjoyed doing it. It was successful, and it was done on time. Money wasn't an object. Moving on to the last real point I'm going to cover tonight, or this afternoon, and that is returning interned aircraft from Switzerland. Now, this is a photograph taken at Dubendorf Airport in Switzerland, which is now a Zurich airport. And this is where many American bombers force landed due to enemy attack, either anti-aircraft guns or from AAA from the ground. Sorry, from night fighters or from German fighters. They don't look as if they were badly damaged, but each aircraft was in fact checked at the end of the war to make sure that these crews didn't just divert to Switzerland to get out of the war. There were genuine reasons, and you'll see some in some movies I've got to show in a moment. So there's a few movies coming up. The aircraft were stored, some of them were badly damaged, and they were pulled to one side. This is only a small proportion of the number which did actually force land. And at the end of the war, the Swiss said, we want you Americans to take them back, please. So Burtonwood got together the mechanics who had got the best track record of being good guys, good mechanics, and also near to going home. And they were flown out to Switzerland to get these aircraft into airworthy condition, or if they couldn't, to scrap them, but just to get them out of the Swiss hair. So there's a few videos coming up which were taken by the Swiss both during and after the war. It's a silent film, there's no soundtrack at all, and the aircraft all look a little bit stretched on it because it's just the way the filming was done. I inherited the film, so I apologize for it, but I had no choice over it. So there's a few different clips showing different things which I'll talk about. So this is the first one. If I can make this work.
Aldon, you may have to click on the actual video itself in the frame.
Here we go. Thank you. Thank you. Here we get, this is a B-17 doing a forced landing. It's a grass strip, there's no runway, and you can see he was damaged. It all went wrong at the end of the landing, to the ground loop, but he's down safely, and probably that crew survived, I would imagine. Predominantly B-24s and B-17s. So there's a B-24. I think he made it successfully. Often crew were injured. Often there was an engine out, or sometimes two engines out. The B-17 coming in. Sometimes the undercarriage would collapse. You can see the little aircraft moving past. That was probably, I would guess, a Swiss aircraft who had been up to intercept him and bring him in. Here we have another one, a B-24, which here's one with an undercarriage problem. You can see the angle of the wheel. He's going around again. Comes in up on his nose. The German writing put together by the, and here's one which actually hit a wall on landing, quite badly damaged. No brakes. Difficult to control when it was landing. I have no idea what happened to the individual crew. 167. Let's just show you the same one again. Sorry, I'll move on. 167 American aircraft successfully force landed in Switzerland in World War II, and 120 of those were at Dubendorf. Clearly, they were advised to aim for Dubendorf. Why, I don't know, but Zurich is reasonably close to the German border. As I say, every aircraft was found to have significant battle damage, and there was never any charges instigated against any of the crew. The crews were interned. The Swiss didn't want them, and they treated them quite badly. They were treated almost as prisoners of war. They were considered to be internees, but they were treated almost identically to how a POW would be treated. Some of them were allowed to escape and disappeared, but the conditions some of them lived in, the food they were given was really poor. If they had crashed in France or in Germany and they had escaped over the border, they were called evadees because they had evaded the enemy and come into a neutral country. And they were treated much better, which is interesting. But the next view should be, oh, this is, sorry, I'm going to go back one if I can. I'll keep moving with this one. I think this is the one we just seen. Sorry, I've got quite a few clips here. Yeah, we've seen this one. I'll move on. So here we have them on the ground. Quite a number of them. You can see how many there were. There we go. Now these are interned air crew. You can see they're not looking particularly happy. There's a guard we will see in a moment with a rifle just there on the right-hand side. And they were now going to be taken into custody and they were going to have to stay for the duration of the war. One of the aircraft. A lot of them are identifiable. There are some colour photographs as well, but they're not my copyright, so I can't show those, unfortunately. Now, 120 men were sent over from Burtonwood, chosen by skill and behaviour. They behaved themselves while they were there, and they considered this to be a perk, although it was pretty hard work. And here we have some of the first ones arriving. Came in a mixture of aircraft, C-47s and C-87s. This is a C-87, the civilian or the cargo conversion of the B-24. You can see the windows on the side of it, and no guns, no gun turrets. And these came in with the men and their equipment because they had to bring everything. You can see the windows on the side of the aircraft. See, there's no armament on it at all. So 120 guys came over from Burtonwood, and they brought all their tools with them. They had to bring tripods to stand the aircraft up, and their role was to get these aircraft back into serviceable condition, but several of them were actually scrapped. There was quite a lot of diplomatic wrangling going on to get authority for them. So although the war had ended in Europe in May 1945, it wasn't until August that they got authority from the Swiss to come in. So here they're carrying their own kit, and they're also, and here you can see the front end with no ammunition, no armament of that C-87. Totally, it wasn't all good news, but most of it was. Here we've got the guys in front of one of the aircraft with a nose art, sleepy time gal, 30 years. Most of them had nose art. Here they covered the front, probably because it was damaged, I would guess, on this B-24. And here they are, now they're fraternizing with the Swiss. Here they have a Swiss guy who is obviously happy to see them. They want them out. and they were looked after extremely well. They were feted, they were wined and dined, they were given very good accommodation. You can see here a restaurant down the bottom left-hand side being dined on the top right up here. This gentleman, Richard Bowman, he was one of our members for a long time. Sadly, he died at the end of last year, and he provided me with probably 200 photographs of Dubendorf and the surrounding area. And he went all around Switzerland and Germany when they had some time off. Had a really good time out there, which was good because they deserved it. And he went back to the States, and as I say, he again passed a huge amount of information across, only to lose him just before Christmas, very sadly. Now, this is a specific C-87, the cargo version of the C-24, arriving from Burtonwood. Sorry, really having trouble getting this video to work. Here we go. Here it comes. It's touched down, and he decided he touched down too fast and too far down the runway. He touched an engine, a propeller on the ground, and he was now on 3, and you can see he can't climb. He's fully laden with equipment, and he can't go around, and he crashes. There are crew and passengers in that aircraft of 6. Fortunately, 2 of them survived. The others didn't. You can see an aircraft up in the air up here, and you can obviously that's the crash. The next shot is taken from that aircraft in the air, which was accompanying it, looking down on it, showing what was happening. Touchdown. They reckon he could have stopped if he had just tried to, but he didn't. He tried to go again, and he couldn't make it. The only aircraft which was lost like that, but sadly, 2 of them survived. 4 of them just didn't. And there was a cemetery built very close by to Dubendorf, where those 4 and others who were killed in air crashes and in some of these forced landings were buried. And this is it. The actual funerals taking place on the top left photograph. Eventually, all the bodies were exhumed and put into an American cemetery in Germany. But I'm also pleased to say that one of the guys who survived is the one on the left here, Sergeant Zachary, Tech Sergeant Zachary, and he became a member of our association. He provided these photographs and provided the full story. And he, again, now sadly has passed away, but he went back to Zurich many, many times to pay tribute to the guys who lost their lives there. And again, a gallant World War II airman. So these aircraft had to be prepared before they could be brought back. A lot of work was required on them. Some of them had been sitting on the ground for over 2 years. Some of them were so badly damaged they had to be scrapped on the spot. Some of these photographs or films are clearly done especially for the image of the camera. Here we are cleaning brake linings on a B-24. A lot of work to do. Check the entire aircraft over. Forget the weaponry. Obviously, they didn't need guns, turrets, etc. anymore. Looks like an elevator being worked on, a fin. Some of those fins were badly damaged on the B-24s. Now, even things like these support tripods had to be brought over in sections from Burtonwood. So you can imagine the weight of these had to be flown in because they had to be totally self-contained. So they could jack the aircraft up and check the undercarriage. Fortunately, we're looking at August and September, and the weather in Switzerland could easily have changed in that time. But you can see by the way they're not dressed that the weather was good, and they managed to get the aircraft back reasonably quickly. They're just making the turret watertight. The guns clearly are not going to operate, probably replacing a piece of plexiglass. They did borrow the cranes, but in some cases they had to take an engine off an aircraft which was not going to make it back to get a serviceable engine onto the aircraft, so that it had 4 serviceable engines. So we had airframe mechanics, we had engine mechanics, we had obviously every trade to get these aircraft back to the UK. And you can see the pile of salvage in the background, and you can see an aircraft there with no engines, no tail. The guys, of course, sitting on an aircraft full of fuel, smoking. They look happy enough. But they did have to scrap some, and I hope the next video will show. No, there's another one. Now this one is going to show the first ones to leave Switzerland. Here they are lined up. They obviously had to test everything before they would do anything. They would then do a fast taxi, and then eventually they'd fly them out. So we've got a couple of B-17s going back to Burtonwood, and a B-24 following up in a moment. So here we go, the proof of the pudding in the work that they've done, taxiing out to take off to go back. Of course, the war was over. We didn't need these aircraft, but we had to get them out of the country and back. So they're obviously anxious. Here we got Swiss guy on the left-hand side as well. And so here's the first one taking off. And it would go straight back to Burtonwood. And it's followed by another one in a moment. There's only a bit of video left, but tried to get the bits which I thought might be the most interesting. There's the second one going. Craft runway note. Aircraft's pretty light. It's got no ammunition, no bombs, just for fuel load to get it back to the UK. And then undercarriage up, then a B-24. Just to prove it did, even though it's taking off in the other direction. There it goes. Some of them didn't make it, and here we have the examples of those that didn't. This one's been well wrapped up for some reason. This one probably did make it back. It's been very well protected. It's a pity the movie isn't a little bit clearer and we could pick out markings better. The stills, here we go. So here's one which has been stripped, and they wanted the undercarriage. So turn it upside down, and they can then work on the undercarriage, cannibalize it, and use any spare parts on any of the other aircraft. There she goes. And they were smelted down into aluminum ingots. It's amazing how big they are when you see someone standing on them like that. Here you've got some fuselages waiting to be paired up together with others, literally hacking them apart. They sold them to Swiss scrap merchants, and the money was given to the Swiss authorities, and in fact it went to charity in the end. Pretty sad to see the end of the aircraft like that, but of course so many thousands of aircraft. The engines were salvaged, and a lot of those engines, some of them made it back to Britain by road or rail, and some of them went on to Germany as well. It's quite interesting, whereas the rest of the aircraft were totally scrapped. I said right at the beginning, this is a person story, and here's just a group of the people. Now, these were the engineering and design people. They're the people who did the conversion for the CG-4A glider, for instance. The Carpetbagger work, they designed the work which was necessary, highly secret. Carl Winkelmann is here on the group photograph. Here he is in his uniform, and here he is at his marriage. He was one of our early members of the association. He gave me, he's got the most magnificent, what I have, what was his most magnificent photo album. It was put together like an engineer. There are hundreds of photographs, but individual photographs of every individual person on this and other photographs. There are drawings, there are photographs of all the work they did. It's just an incredible gift as a memorial and memory of what went on the base. He married Connie. She was an English girl. He met her at the Ritz Dance Hall in Manchester. They married in Ohio in 1947, and he became a lay preacher and was actually our padre for many years. And he was the epitome of our association for many, many years, wartime personnel who just were so, for once, anxious to tell the story. And once we got them together with a group of their friends, they would sit down and chat. I'd sit in with them. In some cases, we managed to record their memories of what they did. And I'm just so lucky that I've got this, and I'm making sure that it's going to be available for the Duxford Museum. They've already got a lot of my photographs, and also our own heritage centre at Burtonwood. My wife and I met so many wonderful people, and it really is so sad that they're not with us anymore. Fortunately, with Burtonwood remaining as an active base throughout the 50s, and then with the army coming in, albeit with far fewer numbers, at least we have people who are keeping the memory alive. And the site has now been redeveloped. There's an interstate road running down the main runway. The whole area has become a massive distribution park, but we have several American companies on it. We've got Walmart on it, we've got Domino Pizza on it, and we've got Amazon on it. There was a test pilot who was flying a YP-80, the very first American jet in the European theatre in January 1945. His name was Frederick Borsodi, and he was killed. The engine exploded overhead Burtonwood, and we just in the last few weeks arranged for a road on one of the new developments to be named after him. It's going to be called Borsodi Boulevard. We have the Airmen's Club in the 50s was known as the Skyline Club. We have one of the major spine roads known as Skyline Drive. On the other side, we have a Lockheed Drive. We have a Dakota Park. And we have a lot of roads named after American states and American rivers. So the whole idea is to keep the memory alive of what happened in this location between 1942 and 1993. We've got plans for a magnificent memorial, but it's secret at the moment because we're still getting permission and getting the finances together. But I would say there's about an 80% chance of it happening, and it's going to be incredible. So Burtonwood was an amazing place which most people have never heard of because it wasn't operational. It never had any operational squadrons there except a weather squadron in the 50s. No aircraft ever took off from Burtonwood to go on a bombing raid, or fighters taking off to go and fight over Europe. But vast numbers went into the base and came out of that base, and the human stories are never ending. We're learning more and more about those all the time. I could talk forever, so I'm going to stop now and hope that that's given you a taster of what went on at Burtonwood Air Base in England during World War II. Thank you very much.
Aldon, thank you so much for your presentation this evening. Thank you for taking us on the journey through the history of this incredible base. I think even going into it, I wasn't aware that a third of the B-17s produced had transited this base and before heading to their operational units. So it's just an absolutely incredible story. We have had a few questions asked, so I know it is going on 11:10 or so, 11:15 there in the UK.
That's okay. No, don't worry.
So we will do our best to keep this Q&A session nice and tight. I think the first question we've got here, Aldon, is how can we support the work you're doing over there in the UK to memorialize American servicemen and their role in fighting for freedom over there in Europe?
Colin, that's a big question. I mean, there is a massive amount of memory which is put in place in the UK. We have the American Air Museum at Duxford. We have Madingley Cemetery. We have our own heritage centre. And many of the bases have their own museums. In many cases, the control tower has been converted into a museum. They're all voluntary. Our own heritage centre is fine. It's in the car park of a children's theme park called Gulliver's World, and they financed the development of the heritage centre, and they pay our manager to operate it. We're totally in their hands. But fortunately, it's a family business. They are very, very pro the work we're doing, and they support us fully. There's no way we can support this out of our own funds, sadly. It's time which is the problem. I have got thousands of photographs, and these need to be properly tagged, and that's taking a lot of time. I'm doing it slowly. I've often thought of getting someone to help me, but it's a soul-destroying job unless you've got it in your heart. I've got it in my heart, and I know exactly what they all are. So support-wise, we do ask people to join the association. It's $30 a year. We produce the magazine. We have our reunions. We have a reunion in the States every year and one in the UK every 2 years. I have a book, which unfortunately there's very few copies in the States except the ones I've sold, and the cost of sending them across by mail is really expensive. But if anybody's really interested in a book, I could, if you gave them my email address, I could send a resume of it and a cost to get it across. But basically, I want everybody to know we are doing everything we can to immortalize and make sure this memory is not lost. And I have this big archive. I have in my will exactly where it's going, but I want to make sure that before I go, that we have this properly indexed so that it's accessible and usable, so that it can be used by generations in the future to remember what happened, not only here at Burtonwood, but all the other American bases in the UK.
Well, it's an admirable task, to be sure. We've got a lot of folks expressing their gratitude for you and the work that you've been doing to remember American servicemen. One of the questions we've got here, Aldon, is a question about the nature of operations there at the field. Why wasn't it attacked by the Germans? Were they unaware of the scale of the operation and its essential nature there at Burtonwood, or was it just beyond their operational capability to actually reach the field and attack it?
It's a really good question because it's very close to Liverpool and Manchester, and both those cities were very heavily blitzed in 1940. I think by the time the space had got really established, we were well into 1943, and our defences at that time had improved dramatically, not only with the Royal Air Force, but with the US Air Force, having fighters there to stop these bombers coming over. Also, our radar was working more efficiently, and the Germans were much more on the defensive than they were on the attack. They only had twin-engine bombers, they had virtually no four-engined aircraft except the big Condor and aircraft like that. So the range was a problem. It was a long way away. They were definitely aware. There was a spy who was caught on site, and when Borsodi crashed and was killed in his P-80 or the YP-80, Lord Haw mentioned it on German radio the same day. So there was somebody on the ground relaying that information. So they knew it was there. They knew Wharton was there as well, which, as far as real estate was concerned, was almost as big. It is amazing they never attacked it. We had random attacks on other bases, but not a single bomb dropped on this base whilst the US Air Force was in it. We had flak guns around the base, but we had a pretty good defensive system by then. I think that's the best reason I can give. It just is staggering because the target was amazing.
Thank you for that answer, Alden. Another question that we've got here relates to how controlled the base was. It looks like it sprawled out, became very, very large. And was it adjacent to a town? Did it grow to encompass the town? Was the base itself secured separate from the town? You mentioned that British civilians had been injured and killed by train accidents on the base, and I think that's led to a curiosity about how was access controlled to the base, and how expansive was it really for the folks that lived there in that region.
Okay, it was secure. No one was allowed on or off the base. It was fenced. It was adjacent to a suburb of the town of Warrington, which was an industrial town. There was coal mining in the area. Warrington was a wire making town and industrial paper box making as well. There were not very many civilians operating on the base. There were a certain number. A lot of them were clerks, typists, cleaners, cooks, that sort of thing. The majority of the work was done by the military. At the very, very beginning, the idea was to try and work the civilian workforce together with the American force, but it didn't work. There were differentials in work ethic and there were differentials in pay. So most of the British were moved out. So the particular people I mentioned who were killed by the trains, they were girls, they were young, they were typists who were operating, telephonists, that sort of thing. But the numbers were low. I would say there were probably 300-400 at the most. Warrington as a town probably then had a population of about 60 to 70,000. Now it's grown over the base. But the guys were operating this shift work, so they had a social life. They could get the train from Warrington to Liverpool and to Manchester. There were dance halls, there were pubs, there were girls. We reckon Burtonwood, from beginning to end, from 1942 to 1993, there were approximately 7,500 marriages between British girls and Americans on the base. We have a huge database of them. There were other aspects of that as well. There were a massive number of illegitimate children. We call them war babies. And there are still people out there of my age who have no idea who their father was. But we have a lady who specializes in that. She's one herself. And anybody who is looking to find their fathers, we just pass them across to her. It's something which is very personal and touchy, and I personally can't get involved with that, but we know someone who can. So the town was taken over by Americans. The dollar economy became incredible, both during and after the war. There were Red Cross clubs in Liverpool and Manchester, American Red Cross clubs. Southport, which was a tourist resort, had two very large hotels taken over by the American Red Cross. London, there were many, many of them. The recreational facilities, when the Americans first arrived in Warrington, Sunday was the Lord's Observance Day. Cinemas, movie theatres were not open, the pubs weren't open. They had to open them up. They had to get the guys off the streets. The very first Americans who arrived, in fact, were civilians from San Antonio, Texas. And they came over as civil service technicians, and they came in civilian clothing. They were called feather merchants because they were treated so much better than the military. But as the military came in, the feather merchants, the civil service technicians were moved out, but they hadn't been long there before they were marrying the girls. Just incredible. So they were separate to the town, but they were very much integrated to the people in the town. Of course, it caused friction as well, with most of the active men were away fighting the war, except those who were in reserved occupations in the mines or in the factories. But the adage, overpaid, oversexed over here, clearly didn't go down well with the British guys, because you guys were whisking our girls off their feet because you were young, you were debonair, you could dance, you had money. And I say most of the American servicemen who came over had never left home before. Most of them had never left the country before. They came over as boys and they left as men.
We've got a question here about Carl Winkleman. Was he originally from Ohio? Do you happen to know which part of Ohio he lived in?
He was from Ohio. I cannot remember offhand. I'm sorry. He was definitely from Ohio. Um, oh dear me, sorry. He passed away in 1999. I wrote to him so many times. Sorry, I'd have to go into the computer to get that information. I can pass it to you by email tomorrow. No problem at all.
So in that case, if you are the asker of that question and you'd like to reach out to the museum, we will have that information here available to you. In the meantime, folks, if you've got any last questions for Aldon, please do go ahead and enter them in here. Failing that, Aldon, this will be my last question that I've got here on the list. Were the British mechanics that were being trained in the facility to work on US equipment, what were they working on specifically? What were we providing operationally? Was it B-24s in Coastal Command or B-17s doing the same thing? Could you maybe speak a little bit more about the training facilities that existed at Burtonwood?
Sure, it was known as an RAF School of Technical Training, number 21. It was actually operated predominantly by British flight engineers, senior NCOs. There were specific courses on engines. There'd be a Wright Cyclone course. There would be a B-17 airframe course. There would be a WASP 1830 course, because these guys were already trained on the, so you get an engine fitter who had already been trained on British engines, and he was really converting onto the American engines. So that was the idea of the course. Mostly they were 2 to 3 weeks in length. On the airframes, they had airframes. They had B-17s, they had B-24s. Later on, they had B-26s. They had A-20s, and they had the fighter aircraft, and even L4s and small aircraft like that. And these were all on BRD site off the airfield, where there was a specific area predominantly to train British mechanics, but a few American mechanics came through as well. Where they were actually based and why they came through this school is difficult to answer, but the predominant number of people on the courses were British tradesmen operating on the squadrons, which were operating Lend-Lease aircraft.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of the presentation tonight. Aldon, thank you so much for your time and for the efforts you've put in to preserve this incredible story. We hope to welcome you back to the Military Aviation Museum at some point in the future. I know you have already visited and enjoyed seeing the aircraft flying over here. So thank you for your time, Aldon. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Keegan, and thank you everybody for joining me. I really do appreciate it.